Okay, so I will continue on the topic of traumatic memory and film aesthetics, and I will discuss Richie Pan's documentary films in relation to the memory of the Khmer Rouge. This is a topic of my postgraduate dissertation that I am currently in the process of writing, and working on this dissertation has been very enlightening, and I now wish to share a piece of it with you. I believe in form, in colors, in light, in frame, and in montage. I believe in poetry. Is that a shocking thing to say? No, the Khmer Rouge did not destroy everything. Richie Pan writes in his book, The Elimination. The Khmer Rouge regime caused, between 1975 and 1979, the death of 1.7 million people in Cambodia, who were murdered, died of starvation, illness, and physical and mental exhaustion. The Khmer Rouge sent city dwellers to labor camps in order to re-educate them. They wanted Cambodia to become a self-sufficient country and intended to achieve this goal through radical agricultural and social reforms based on collectivization. Cambodia's former structures were destroyed to create a new society where the party, known as Angkar, was omnipotent. French Cambodian filmmaker Richie Pan went through the Khmer Rouge and lost almost all his family members to it. Haunted by this tragedy, he dedicates his filmography to the Khmer Rouge. Richie Pan was born in 1964 in Phnom Penh. He was 11 years old when the Khmer Rouge took power and sent him and his family to labor camps. Pan arrived in France in 1979 as a political refugee. In 1985, he enrolled at EDEC, a prestigious French film school, and became a filmmaker. He then started making documentary films on the Khmer Rouge. Pan earned international recognition with his documentary film S-21, The Khmer Rouge Killing Machine, which is about the S-21 Khmer Rouge prison, in which 14,000 people were tortured and murdered. In this film, he brings perpetrators and victims of S-21 back in the former prison to discuss the events that took place there. For my presentation, I study Pan's most recent Khmer Rouge documentary films, which are The Missing Picture, Exile, and Graves Without a Name. The main question is, how does Richie Pan use cinema, and more specifically aesthetics, to grapple with the memory of the Khmer Rouge? I will show you a short excerpt of the trailer of The Missing Picture.
Il y a tant d'images dans le monde qu'on croit avoir tout vu, tout pensé. Depuis des années, je cherche une image qui manque. Une photographie prise entre 1975 et 1979 par les Khmer Rouges quand ils dirigeaient le Cambodge. À elle seule, bien sûr, une image ne prouve pas le crime de masse, mais elle donne à penser, à méditer.
So a few words about Richie Pan's documentary films. The Missing Picture was released in 2013 and received an Oscar nomination. In this film, Pan reconstitutes his experience of the Khmer Rouge through clay figurines that represent himself and his family members. The Missing Picture marks a shift in Pan's cinema. Indeed, Pan's documentary style used to be more traditional. His previous documentaries, such as S-21, were impersonal, informative, and relatively objective. They were composed of sequence shots of witnesses talking about the Khmer Rouge. Pan used to stay behind the camera and not let his presence known. On the contrary, The Missing Picture is personal, and the images of the film are more metaphorical and aesthetic. In Exile and Graves Without a Name, Pan continues to engage with his subjectivity and with aesthetics to talk about the Khmer Rouge. Exile tells the story of a younger version of Pan, played by Cambodian actor Sang Nan, who survives on his own under the Khmer Rouge. The entire film takes place in a shelter where reality, dream, and imagination intertwine. This film is not narrative-driven and does not provide much historical context. It is all about aesthetic experience, which is also the case in Graves Without a Name. In Graves Without a Name, Pan goes back to the field where his family died under the Khmer Rouge. he undergoes Buddhist ceremonies to contact the dead. The film alternates between sequences of him going through the various rituals and poetic and aesthetic shots, which include shots of trees, views of the skies, shots of empty fields. Scholars have interpreted Pan's cinematic shift as a means to represent a genocide for which images are missing. I agree with this argument, but will add that Pan's film aesthetics allow him to engage with the memory of the Cambodian genocide. While his previous documentaries were more concerned with recovering the history of the Khmer Rouge, with reaching a historical truth, the missing picture, Exile, and Graves Without a Name are memory-oriented. Marianne Hirsch explains that the difference between history and memory is the importance of the affective experience. Memory signals an affective link to the past, she writes. Pan's documentaries are preoccupied with emotions and sensations rather than facts. And because the missing picture, Exile, and Graves Without a Name deal with his personal experience of the Khmer Rouge, I thought that it could be pertinent to link them to autobiographical memory. William Brewer describes autobiographical memory as, I quote, memory for information related to the self. To Brewer's definition, David Rubin adds that one of the main components of autobiographical memory is verbal narrative. He specifies that, I quote, autobiographical memories are usually recalled as words, often as stories. The verbal structure of an autobiographical memory is a structure of the genre of narrative that it is. In The Missing Picture, Pan presents his new approach to documentary film, which includes a first-person narrator. The first-person narrator used by Pan echoes with Rubin's idea of a verbal narrative, as it allows him to structure his memories and to share them through words. The Missing Picture, Exile and Graves Without a Name retrace the filmmaker's progression as he explores the first-person narrative and grows more comfortable with the idea of addressing an autobiographical memory of the Khmer Rouge. Pan used to completely disappear behind the camera in his previous films, but here he shows himself in various ways. His first appearance in front of the camera is rather shy. We see his eye in the first sequence of The Missing Picture, but yet the eye is a telling synecdoche, as it mirrors the fact that in this film, Pan tells the history of the Khmer Rouge through his eyes. And for the rest of the films, he uses clay figurines that represent him and his family. In Exile, Cambodian actor Seng Nan interprets a younger version of Pan, and in Graves Without a Name, Pan goes one step further and fully embraces the first-person narrative as he plays his own role and appears in camera. Rubin notes that autobiographical memory is composed of visual imagery, which separates autobiographical memories from facts. Pan explores the memory of the Khmer Rouge through images that represent personal souvenirs in The Missing Picture, Exile, and Graves Without a Name. The accent is not put on facts, but on personal events inscribed in the bigger history that he visually recalls. Finally, Rubin claims that emotions are another main component of autobiographical memory. This applies to Pan's The Missing Picture, Exile, and Graves Without a Name, which are dedicated to the souvenirs that he's the most emotionally connected to. In The Missing Picture, one of the most powerful sequences is the one in which Pan addresses the death of his father. In Shoah, French filmmaker Claude Lanzmann makes a documentary film about the Nazi extermination camps with no archive images, which initiated the debate on the representation of genocide on screen. Lanzmann promotes a prohibition against representation, for he estimates that no images can represent the reality of the Shoah. For that reason, he dismisses Steven Spielberg's Schindler's List, which intends to reconstitute Auschwitz through fiction. In this debate on representation, Pan sides with Lanzmann. He estimates that Schindler's List, I quote, goes too far and falls into voyeurism with the infamous gas chamber scene. Nonetheless, Pan is less categoric than Lanzmann on the question of archive images and uses some of them in his films. An image cannot prove mass murder, but it gives us cause for thought, he says in the trailer of The Missing Picture. Pan also proposes another way to tackle the question of representation, which is aesthetics. He aestheticizes his shots in the missing picture, Exile and Graves Without a Name, which serves an ethical purpose regarding the representation of the genocide, for it is a way to suggest horror instead of showing it. Art is a cinematographic solution to the problem of representation, Pan declares. In Graves Without a Name, the image of a field progressively getting covered by clothes suggests the mass murders that occurred in the killing fields. Pan does not show human blood, bones, nor bodies, which would be unethical. Yet, the symbolic and aesthetic images he presents allow the viewers to imagine and reflect on the atrocities perpetrated by the Khmer Rouge regime. Memory is not something fixed. You know, it also changes, Pan says. And his film aesthetics simulates memory's unstable nature and the process of remembering traumatic memory. Pan explains that the story comes back to him in fragments through dreams, and that he then wakes up and almost doesn't remember it. Susanna Radstone notes that cinema language adopts terms associated with memory, such as the flashback and the fade. And Pan's missing picture relies on flashbacks, for it alternates between memories of the Khmer Rouge and souvenirs of his childhood before the war. The opening sequence of the missing picture imitates the process of remembering. The entangled film rolls suggest the sinuosity of memory, and the fade transitions between the shots further emphasize the fragility of memory that fades over time. In his documentaries, Pan also presents aesthetics as a way to fight atrocity. The filmmaker believes in poetry, for it is what saved him under the Khmer Rouge. He confesses that, I quote, he did not find any other form outside of the poetic and artistic form to keep his humanity. Exile metaphorically shows that Pan found refuge in his imagination and in poetry to survive under the Khmer Rouge. At night, he found comfort in conversing with the moon and in his dreams. I have a story to transmit, and I have the dignity of those people who died to defend, Pan assures. The filmmaker believes that his mission is to transmit the memory of the Khmer Rouge, but he does not want to transmit it through information and facts. Rather, he wishes to transmit it in a sensory and intimate way. Pan uses moving images to render his memory of the Khmer Rouge sensible to the one who watches it. In one of the sequences of Exile, Pan struggles with the grief of his mother, who died under the Khmer Rouge. The filmmaker's alter ego, played by Song Nan, imagines his mother's hands caressing his cheeks. The close-up shot invites us to empathize with the protagonist. It also seems to invite us to feel his mother's hands caressing our own faces through him. Indeed, Pan believes that, I quote, the power of cinema is to give you the capacity to open your mind, open your eyes, be sensible to what happens. Concerned with making the viewer access a deeper understanding of the memory of the Khmer Rouge, Pan transmits it through an aesthetic, poetic, and emotional experience. The viewer associates the close-up shots on a hatcher hitting a tree, which results in the tree bleeding, with the murder committed by the Khmer Rouge. In this shot, Pan does not directly tell the viewer about the murders, but addresses the viewer emotionally, who is overwhelmed by the feeling of violence. The truth is what you feel after watching the film, not in the image itself, Pan declares. The missing picture, Exile, and Graves Without a Name, by transmitting the memory of the Khmer Rouge, contributes to the making of post-memory. Hirsch explains that, I quote, post-memory describes the relationship that the generation after bears to the personal, collective, and cultural trauma of those who came before, to experiences they remember only by means of the stories, images, and behavior among which they grew up. But these experiences were transmitted to them so deeply and affectively as to seem to constitute memories in their own right. Being a second-generation Cambodian myself, I relate to not having literal memories of the Khmer Rouge, but still bearing my parents' memories of it. My family's experience of something as traumatic as the Cambodian genocide makes me particularly sensitive to Pan's films, for the aesthetic experience they provide is converted, in my case, into post-memory. When second-generation Cambodians see Pan's autobiographical memories of the Khmer Rouge that are evoked on screen through aesthetic and metaphorical cinematic shots, they access a representation of the Khmer Rouge, one that is so affectively charged that it allows them to remember it, although they were not directly there when the events happened. To conclude, Susanna Redstone writes that cinema has a long-standing and intimate relationship with memory. It allows mourning, remembrance, and even perhaps forgetting. Pan believes that his mission is to remember the Khmer Rouge through cinema. He writes to himself in La Paix avec les morts, "Never close this chapter. Closing my eyes, it sounds so tempting, but never forget you open them again. Promise me." Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Eva, for your thought-provoking presentation on a very interesting filmmaker who is calling our attention consistently to the fact that a filmmaker is a person who lives in the world and who has a personal experience and can do cinema building from their own experience. I think we will come back to these questions later. I will just remember the audience that you can drop your questions in the chat. Okay, so do that. And we will have now Temenuga Trifonova, who will be presenting Haunting Memories and Living Ghosts in European Migration Cinema. Temenuga Trifonova, when you feel ready.
Hi. So I should begin by saying that my paper is 20 minutes. So I'll just
No
start.
problem.
Yeah.
Eva just spoke for 16 minutes, so we can don't talk for 24, but 21. Okay. So.
Okay. So not only has co-presence gradually emerged as the dominant theoretical paradigm to describe the migrants or refugees' deregulated experience of time and space, but co-presence has also come to dramatize a heightened historical consciousness, as evidenced by European films' growing tendency to frame the ethical questions raised by migrants and refugees in terms of past forms of oppression and marginalization, with the Holocaust serving as the ultimate ground for legitimation. Not surprisingly, the trope of ghosting or haunting recurs regularly in these films. Esther Perrin has explored spectrality as a metaphor for both the dispossession and empowerment of certain subjects, including migrants and refugees, who are regularly perceived as living ghosts. In this paper, I will examine the ways in which a number of recent European films engage with the ethical limits of Europeans' responsibility to the illegal other by relying on the trope of spectrality to underscore the co-presence of past and present, by blurring the boundaries between past, present, and future, and approaching contemporary problems through a magical, farcical, or absurdist lens. The films foreground the historical continuity between various forms of injustice and exploitation, ultimately revealing the relentless reproduction of violence as a cycle seemingly without end. An early predecessor to these films is Gianni Amelio L'America, which uses an amnesiac protagonist to explore the overlapping of mutual haunting of different historical periods and political regimes, fascism, communism, and global capitalism, in order to expose the continuities between them. While the film opens with a newsreel about Albania's colonization by Mussolini's army in 1939, the story proper begins 50 years later, as fascism and communism have both supposedly become a thing of the past. Although Albania is no longer Italy's puppet fascist state, it has now entered the next neo-colonial phase of its national history, with desperate Albanians welcoming the former Italian colonizers who present themselves as Albania's benefactors. In 1991, following the fall of communism, this is the story of the film, Italian con artists Gino and Fiore travel to a lawless Albania to set up a fake shoe factory in order to get their hands on Italian state subsidies to Albania's post-communist economy. Looking for a front for their company, they stumble upon a traumatized 70-year-old anti-communist political prisoner, Spiro, who has been driven mad and amnesiac by 20 years of hard labor in communist labor camps, and who looks indistinguishable from a concentration camp victim. Later, we find out that Spiro is not an anti-communist hero, but actually an Italian, Michele, who deserted Mussolini's army in 1939 and went into hiding under an Albanian name, but was never told that World War II ended. In the film's final sequence, Gino and Michele board a ship bound for Italy. A series of documentary-like close-ups of hundreds of undocumented immigrants on the ship, including Gino and Michele, who believes the boat is headed to America, cannot but help recall those of the 4 million impoverished Italians who immigrated to America in the beginning of the 20th century, fleeing rural poverty in southern Italy and later fascism. While historians René Sigrist and Stella Gervas have called, what historians René Sigrist and Stella Gervas have called the victim paradigm is particularly relevant to the conflation of different historical periods and political regimes in America, as well as in the other films I discuss. Throughout the 20th century, they argue, Europe was a victim of two totalitarian systems, fascism and communism. The contemporary multicultural European cocktail of common values and bricolage of identities is, according to them, a product of the attempts of various marginalized and oppressed groups, for example, migrants, ethnic minorities, gays and lesbians, refugees, stateless people, homeless people, etc., to reclaim their identity by positioning themselves as victims of one or both of these systems, often relating their own oppression to previous forms of oppression in their own country or in other European countries. Sigrist and Gervas remain ambivalent about the victim paradigm. On one hand, they draw attention to its potential abuses by different groups, but they also suggest that it could potentially serve as the ground for a shared European identity. They argue that just by according to them, by challenging les lieux de mémoire nationale with their transnational claims, these victim-based groups, for example, second and third generation immigrants, refugees, asylum seekers, etc., might offer a way to transcend the classical inter-European schisms that have so far defined European history and reform European values along the lines of compassion and solidarity. If the Jews offered Europe a way to define itself as lieu de mémoire, with the Holocaust serving as a source of a shared European memory or identity, these new victims, including migrants and refugees, might be seen as offering the newest European version of lieu de mémoire. Sigrist and Gervas' analysis of the victim paradigm illuminates the challenge that all of the films I analyze here face, the creation of a historical consciousness in and by cinema. If Sigrist and Gervas suggest that one historical event, the Holocaust, has become the ultimate ground of legitimation, Jean-Michel Frodin's edited volume, Cinema and the Shoah, makes clear what is really at stake in the creation of a historical consciousness. While Frodin posits the Shoah as the crisis of the visible and a question of and for cinema, arguing that its unrepresentability constitutes both the aesthetic and ethical criterion according to which films about the Shoah ought to be judged, others, like Marie-José Monzen, for instance, insist that thinking of the Shoah as unrepresentable, as radical evil, precludes the possibility of expressing the past in the present, of allowing the Shoah to enter history not in order to forget it, but precisely to make it live in the present. While I share Monzen's point of view, in the remainder of this paper, I want to draw attention to some of the challenges of making the past live in the present through the trope of haunting and spectrality, especially in terms of, one, downplaying the historical particularity of the different experiences that the films recount, and two, confusing or making ambiguous the political stance of the films in question. Happy as Lazzaro, unfortunately, I don't have time to summarize in great detail the plots of the films, so I'm just assuming that everybody has seen at least some of them. Happy as Lazzaro, 2018, tells the story of a group of villagers exploited as unpaid labor to harvest tobacco for the Marchesa, despite the outlawing of sharecropping as a practice in Italy in the early 1980s. That the film is intended as a political allegory is clear from its purposeful withholding of any temporal and spatial coordinates. One memorable sequence in which Lazzaro, walking towards the city, I don't have a picture of that sequence, unfortunately, joins a crowd of unemployed, illegal immigrants of different ethnic and racial backgrounds, paints a potent image of the reproduction of the system of inequalities, with the peasants and workers of the past now replaced by the refugees and illegal migrants of the present. The film shows the perpetuation of class inequalities by tracing the historical continuity between the aristocracy and the petit bourgeoisie of the past, represented in the film by the characters of Nicola and the Marchesa, and the exploiters of the present, the European Central Bank and the traffickers of illegal labor, like the older Nicola, who recruits illegal workers by auctioning available jobs to those who offer to do them for the least amount of money. Although Lazaro is a figure with whom any Europeans who perceive themselves as disenfranchised can identify, a figure onto which different social groups can project their own claims phrased in terms of victimhood, this figure's main symbolic function in the film is to represent the reproduction of class relations rather than the attainment of class consciousness. In fact, Lazaro could be seen as the embodiment of false consciousness. Whether Lazaro is a slave or a saint depends on whether he is a subject in Ranciere's sense of the term, and thus conscious of his position in the social, political, and economic order. The film's ending suggests that Lazaro becomes conscious of and reacts to the injustice that he and those around him suffer. But of what exactly does Lazaro become conscious in the end? What injustice does he seek to correct by going to the bank in the final scene? Has he finally become aware of the injustices perpetrated against him and the other inhabitants of the village in Violata, who, even after seemingly being emancipated from their feudal position, continue to be exploited and abandoned by the same system that claimed to have emancipated them? Not really. At one point, the older Tancredi invites Lazaro and the other villagers to lunch at his house, but they're turned away by Tancredi's wife, who explains to them that the bank has ruined the Marquesas family and confiscated all of her properties. Lazaro exclaims, "The great swindle!" Although Antonia and the others remind him that the great swindle refers to their own victimization and oppression at the hands of the Marquesa, Lazaro is deeply moved by what he perceives as a great injustice done to the Marquesas family. He has finally become class conscious, yes, only ironically conscious of the injustices suffered by the wrong class. In the last scene, he goes to the bank to demand that the Marquesa's properties be returned to her. But since the villagers, including himself, used to belong to the Marquesa, what Lazaro actually demands is his and the others' re-enslavement. Lazaro is no longer the saintly figure he was in the beginning of the film, but a reactionary figure, nostalgic for the old pre-neoliberal form of oppression, which for him does not even represent oppression, but simply the natural state of things. In short, he is an obstacle to class struggle. It is not Lazaro, but the former farmhands, now the lumpen proletariat, who at the end of the film begin to show signs of class consciousness as they consider for the first time the possibility of resistance. And here I'm referring to People's half-joking proposition to return to the village and squat the Marquesas' house without bosses. Like Lazaro, Transit, an adaptation of Anna Zegers' 1944 novel, Transit, is an allegory explicitly engaged with Europe's current political and humanitarian crisis, with Petzold intentionally keeping the temporal coordinates vague so as to allow the echoes of the past, specifically the Holocaust, to reverberate in the present and vice versa. The time warping produces some interesting effects, which is especially noticeable in the sequence showing Georg's night escape from Paris to Marseille, accompanied by his wounded friend Heinz, whose wife, Melissa, and son, Driss, are waiting for him in Marseille. While the shots of the trains cannot fail to recall the trains transporting millions of Jews to the death camps, this reference to the past is deliberately conflated with the more recent visual memory of thousands of illegal migrants and refugees trying to enter Europe, locked up in the back of trucks, many of them suffocating to death. Here, the political allegory flattens all temporal distinctions. The current refugee crisis is figured metaphorically through a reference to the Holocaust, while at the same time, the dystopian present or future day Holocaust, depicted by the film literally rather than metaphorically, is figured through a reference back to the current refugee crisis. With the introduction of the characters of Melissa and Driss, both of Maghrebi origin and both illegal immigrants in France in the film, France's colonial past adds a third temporal layer to that of the 1940s and the 2000s, with France's Boer population becoming the third victimized group in the series of transnational and transhistorical cases of victimhood explored in the film. France's colonial legacy, the Holocaust, and the refugee crisis, the first decidedly French, the other two European phenomena, enter into a symbolic chain of mutually exchangeable identities. A Boer is a Jew, is a refugee. Although the narrative's temporal complexity and allegorical function are central to the film, Transit is not so much about the refugee crisis or the Holocaust, or even about the continuity between the two. Petzold is mostly interested in exploring the existential experience of passing through, the temporal and spatial disruption of an existence suspended between the past and the future, there and here, then and now, in the limbo of co-presence. In an interview with Franz Rogowski, the actor who plays Georg, he comments on the difficulty of playing a character who is supposed to inhabit two temporal frames at the same time. Quote, "Georg is a refugee, Therefore, he has lost his home, but he's also a ghost that starts his journey in Germany's 1940s. He's actually born in the novel, in the book of a German writer, and he finds himself in today's Marseille. But also, Georg is a drifter. There is not much he could lose. He has no family. There is no apartment or work. End of quote. When Rogowski describes Georg as a drifter and explicitly states later in the interview that he was not trying to represent a refugee, he urges us to see Georg not as a specific historical figure, but as an allegorical figure representing any kind of existential sense of displacement, homelessness, or exile. Tellingly, at one point in the film, Georg tells a Kafkaesque story about a man who had to report to hell and waited for years in front of a door only to be informed that this is hell. The collapsing of temporal and spatial markers in transit and Lazaro, which renders ethnic, racial, and political differences as a symbolic chain of mutually exchangeable identities, a Boer is a Jew is a refugee, is becoming something of a genre trope in films exploring Europe's current predicament. Filmed in close quarters in an allotment area in the center of Vienna that recalls the self-enclosed artificial space of a refugee camp, the film Nobody, 2019, tells the story of an aging, taciturn Robert who, following the death of his dog, needs help to bury him. Adib, a young Afghani refugee desperately looking for work, offers his services despite his injured during his journey to Europe. The film stages the conflict between the two men across political, racial, and generational lines, referencing in the same gesture the Odyssey, one of the core texts making up Europe's cultural heritage, and the absolute negation of that legacy, the Nazi past. The title Nobody invokes the violation of refugees' human rights and the Nazi extermination of the Jews. The collapsing of temporal historical difference manifests itself as well in the film's conflation of the figures of the victim and victimizer through that of Nobody, a figure clearly intended to mediate between them. Just as Adib's tattoo, Nobody, brands him as another anonymous victim, Robert's tattoo, which, like the tattoos of all SS members, identifies his blood group, 0, brands him as Nobody. His blood type, 0, references both the destruction of life, the extermination of the Jews, and the erasure of responsibility on the part of the Nazi. Thus, Nobody invokes in the same breath bare life, suppressed guilt, and nomadism. And note that Nobody is also the pseudonym used by Odysseus, the Ur-nomad. Like Nobody, The Barefoot Emperor, 2019, mines the trope of spectrality to underscore the co-presence of past and present, though in a more surrealist vein. In this toothless political satire, the Belgian king, returning home from Istanbul after learning that during his absence Wallonia has seceded and Belgium no longer exists, is mistakenly shot in Sarajevo during a theatrical reenactment of Franz Ferdinand's 1914 assassination, and later finds himself in an exclusive sanatorium housed in Tito's former summer home, where he is informed that his shooting has sparked the end of the EU and the rise of Nova Europa, to be ruled by a new emperor who turns out to be none other than the Belgian king himself. The film's scrambled historical references from the disintegration of Yugoslavia, seen here as a precedent for the EU's collapse, to Hitler, Mussolini, Che Guevara, Ceausescu, and so on, turn European history into a hall of mirrors in which the lines between past and present, politics and popular culture, between different political ideals, are rendered meaningless. For example, each patient in the sanatorium is named after the room in which various stars from the world of politics and entertainment resided back in Tito's time. The Belgian king is now Brezhnev, with the other patients named Indira Gandhi, Castro, Arafat, Elizabeth Taylor, and so on. The film's politics remains ambiguous. While it suggests the idea of a paradoxically united Europe of nationalists, led for some inexplicable reason by an emperor, even though the European Parliament has been abolished, it also fails to develop in a more nuanced, not merely allegorical way, some of its crass political jokes. For example, the idea that migrants used to be a problem until they became a business. The film's ending, too, is undernourished, though clearly allegorical in its literalness, in the way it imagines the potential rebirth of Europe from the ashes of nationalism, communism, and fascism. The future of Europe, in the end, is contingent upon Europeans' ability to literally put themselves in refugees' shoes. And so, in the end of the film, the king and his entourage managed to return to Brussels only by being smuggled back illegally by a group of Indian climate refugees. Finally, Tony Kravitz's film Dead Europe, 2012, draws on several genres: supernatural, horror, historical drama, Holocaust film, refugee film, ghost story, and road movie, to tell another allegorical story about contemporary Europe, imagined as an underground imagined in the film as an underground network of illegality, exploitation, racial prejudice, and anti-Semitism, and visually as a series of camp-like neighborhoods and refugee-populated apartment buildings whose homogeneity makes the different cities where the action takes place, Athens, Paris, and Budapest, indistinguishable. By lumping together all problems plaguing Europe, from racial prejudice and anti-Semitism through drug problems and the porno industry to the refugee crisis and religious conflicts, the film feeds into the familiar migrancy problematic, which blames migrants and refugees for all of Europe's social, political, and economic problems. The film, which figures the co-presence of past and present through the familiar trope of the family curse, traces the journey of Isaac, a young Greek-Australian gay photographer, back to his ancestral homeland, where he uncovers his family's secret past. When Isaac tells his father, Vasily, a former Communist Party member, that he's going to Athens for a gallery exhibition of his work, his father drives off in his car at a suicidal speed, eventually dying in a car crash. Isaac then takes his father's ashes back to his Greek birthplace, where he gradually learns of a family curse. In Athens, Isaac meets a young refugee, Yosef, here pictured in this shot, and begins taking photographs of him. At one point, he leaves to recharge the camera, but when he returns, Yosef is gone. Throughout the rest of the film of his European journey, Isaac is haunted by the image of Yosef, a metaphor for a past wrong that Isaac and his family can never make right. Like Transit, Dead Europe posits anti-Semitism and anti-immigrant attitudes as two faces of the same coin. The dark secret that Isaac eventually uncovers concerns a Jewish boy, Elias, whom Isaac's father and his family offered to protect during the Second World War in exchange for money, but eventually betrayed. Isaac's grandmother raped the boy, and Isaac's father did nothing to prevent it, instead waiting until the boy was almost dead and killing him. Figuring the family sin primarily as one of sexual assault and only secondarily as murder sets the tone for the rest of the film, which frames the gay cause, Isaac is gay and his brother Nico is a junkie working in the gay porn industry, through a reference to the Holocaust. Significantly, when Elias, the Jewish boy Isaac's father betrayed, returns as a ghost haunting Isaac's family, it is in the guise of the young refugee Joseph. Thus, like the other films discussed here, Dead Europe depicts the claims of three different groups, Jews, gays, and refugees, as mutually exchangeable, downplaying or erasing the historical particularity of their experiences and referring them all back to the Holocaust as the ultimate ground for legitimation. I think that's 20 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Temenuga Trifonova, for this fascinating tour through several films which thematize difference through the figure of the spectre in contemporary cinema, European cinema. That's interesting. We can come back to it later. And now we'll have, I will give the floor to Diogo Freire, who will be presenting, que vai apresentar uma comunicação intitulada Cavalo, Coelho, Elefante, Virtualidades da Memória no Cinema Contemporâneo. Quando quiser.
Boa tarde a todos, agradeço a vossa presença e conto com a vossa paciência para o que poderá parecer uma proposta algo introdutória. Enfim, este é um tema que mereceria um trabalho ainda mais aprofundado e mais longo do que o que eu vou poder conduzir aqui. Em todo o caso, aquilo que eu me proponho a fazer é uma defesa da dimensão virtual da memória. E isto poderá parecer desde logo uma redundância, porque a memória é entendida filosoficamente como um virtual da experiência humana, quer dizer, o passado é como uma nuvem que envolve cada objeto presente que se apresenta diante de nós, na nossa percepção. Temos amplos exemplos disso na literatura e no cinema, não vale a pena elencá-los, mas para todos os efeitos, em torno de cada coisa presente, há sempre essa névoa de imagens virtuais, de imagens do passado, que são um conjunto de interações possíveis. Há um cheiro que nos lembra, que nos faz viajar imediatamente para a infância, enfim, esse género de fenómenos. Mas, a meu ver, esta dimensão virtual que eu mais à frente definirei com maior rigor, tem sido preterida em favor de conceitos, a meu ver, deturpados da memória, e vou explicar em que medida é que são deturpações do conceito de memória. A primeira, que é a mais amplamente criticada, não me vou demorar muito nela, Foucault já escreveu o suficiente sobre ela, tem que ver com a memória como o historicismo clássico faz uso dela, o conceito de memória. Aí a memória é sempre a memória coletiva, a memória de um povo, e é sempre uma oportunidade, um operador que permite um revisionismo histórico, sempre no sentido de identificar uma cadeia causal e necessária de acontecimentos que dá origem a este povo, que faz revelar a sua essência, a sua identidade. Enfim, é um discurso essencialista, metafísico, que tende a negar o puramente acidental, o contingente e a mestiçagem que está na base de cada povo. Mas não é tanto esta deturpação que me preocupa, é mais a segunda, que é mais recente. Tem que ver com a confusão entre a memória e os arquivos mais sofisticados que dispomos, o arquivo digital. Vou-me referir ao longo da apresentação em termos muito genéricos como o arquivo digital. E, bom, a espacialização da memória não é novidade nenhuma, desde Santo Agostinho, que a memória é pensada como quase uma espécie de um armazém. Os psicólogos no século XX sempre fizeram uso dessa metáfora do armazém, o armazém infinito. Até temos o termo feliz memória de trabalho. Enfim, há uma série de indicadores que permitem pensar esta espacialização da memória, e ela foi certamente útil até para a ciência da memória, na medida em que livrou o conceito de uma série de preconceitos teológicos, nomeadamente o preconceito da alma, que faziam da memória uma coisa muito etérea e, enfim, nós hoje estamos no outro extremo, em que até queremos localizar exatamente no cérebro onde está a memória, queremos mapear e portanto, estamos num paradigma muito mais fisicalista da memória. Mas, para todos os efeitos, o que é que sucede no arquivo? É que, com o seu nível de rigor e de detalhe de tratamento de dados em quantidades inumanas, que nenhum ser humano consegue processar, promete-nos potenciar a memória, como já tantas outras tecnologias potenciaram. Mas, e eu não questiono isto, como é óbvio, mas parece-me que, mesmo assim, não podemos deixar que o arquivo sature a noção de memória, porque precisamente o arquivo não tem em conta esta virtualidade. O arquivo trabalha sobretudo na dimensão da disponibilidade. Existe um conjunto de dados de passado que está disponível como uma matéria-prima, como petróleo, enfim, que a qualquer momento nós podemos extrair para fins utilitários. E isso, por exemplo, nas redes sociais, podemos a qualquer momento ver, há aquela opção até no Facebook. Há um ano atrás, enfim, nós sabemos exatamente o que estávamos a fazer, com quem estávamos, onde estávamos há um ano atrás. Há esta presentificação do passado que não constitui uma atualização, no sentido de não constitui uma relação com o virtual da memória. Portanto, há aqui logo uma diferença que pode ser feita entre o virtual da memória e o digital do arquivo, apesar de que muitas vezes se confunde virtual com digital. Ora, o virtual opera numa lógica, e eu agora posso dar uma definição um bocadinho mais aprofundada, e estou a pensar sobretudo na sequência de Deleuze e de Brian Massumi, em que o virtual opera numa lógica da relação, a relação que precede os termos individuados. O virtual é uma multiplicidade de relações diferenciais que a todo momento estão a produzir um ser discreto, um ser individuado, um ser descontínuo, enquanto que o virtual é este fundo de contínua variação, mas que está constantemente ativo. O que é que nós verificamos no arquivo digital? Não é toda esta lógica, e o Massumi insiste várias vezes neste ponto, Brian Massumi, filósofo canadiano, porque ele diz que no virtual aquilo que nós encontramos são possibilidades. O software propõe-nos possibilidades e o possível ou se realiza ou não. Conforme as nossas interações, umas possibilidades vão ser realizadas, outras não. Ora, o virtual não se realiza, o virtual é sempre real, quer se atualiza ou não, quer esta componente da memória se atualiza ou não, quer eu me relembre do facto X quando pego no objeto Y, quer isso aconteça ou não, o virtual tem realidade, permanece real. As coisas não deixam simplesmente de existir por não as termos à nossa frente, que posto em termos muito simples. Ora, o que é que, nesse sentido, o digital tem ainda uma agravante, que é a experiência vivida da memória, a experiência virtual da memória, comporta intensidades, comporta afetos e comporta o corpo. E nós não experimentamos, não vivemos o enunciado simbólico, eu ontem fui à loja. Nós podemos articular simbolicamente a memória e dizer, eu ontem fui à loja, mas a recordação, a memória, ocorre num plano pré-linguístico que comporta intensidades e afetos. Mesmo que, por acaso, este exemplo não foi bom, porque não é uma experiência propriamente afetiva ir a uma loja, mas, enfim, o que me interessa aqui é, de facto, deixar claro que o regime simbólico do arquivo não potencia o virtual e não se pode falar de uma lógica de virtual, mas antes do possível. E onde é que, a meu ver, entra o cinema nesta equação? É que, sendo o cinema um médium que já podemos com segurança caracterizar como velho ou envelhecido, ele já conquistou, muito graças aos seus autores, seus grandes autores, já conquistou um plano de virtualidade e por isso consegue compensar insensibilidades dos novos mídia, dos novos arquivos que, de facto, ainda trabalham sobretudo na linha cronológica e na linha do sequencial, do instantâneo e do possível. Portanto, eu vou trazer-vos 3 exemplos, vou passar muito brevemente por eles, até para não exceder os limites de tempo, mas que, a meu ver, são 3 belíssimas figurações deste virtual da memória, de formas absolutamente diferentes umas das outras, e que podemos situar os 3 filmes. Há uma série de rótulos que parecem adequar-se, o cinema de fluxo, o slow cinema, mas às vezes são um pouco equívocos essas designações. Eu vou preferir uma que já é clássica e que não será a primeira vez que vai ser invocada nestas conferências, que é da imagem-tempo, e justamente é um conceito que devemos a Deleuze, na forma como eu estou a pensar. A imagem-tempo refere-se a um cinema que já não tem o comportamento, o par ação-reação a estruturar os filmes. Isto é, nós já não encontramos sequer personagens muito bem definidas que sejam a comportar diante da câmara. A câmara já não opera uma seleção tão narrativa e económica daquilo que elas fazem. Aliás, o Deleuze fala mesmo em situações ópticas e sonoras puras, ou seja, temos imagens que são muito menos restritas em termos ontológicos, exigem até a atenção do espectador para, de facto, ver a imagem, em vez de simplesmente comportar-se, reagir ao que está a ver. É um cinema moderno, típico do pós-guerra, e, a meu ver, estes 3 filmes, apesar de bastante distantes dos primeiros da imagem-tempo, ainda cabem perfeitamente nessa designação. Vou começar com O Cavalo de Dinheiro, de Pedro Costa, que é um filme que, desde logo, de onde eu vou extrair a primeira premissa para pensar um virtual da memória. Mas primeiro é preciso lembrar que este filme propõe uma espécie de um novo expressionismo cinematográfico em que o interior se confunde com o exterior. Isto é, o interior, tempo psíquico, psicológico, biográfico da personagem confunde-se com o tempo histórico do seu país e dando uma sinopse muito rápida para quem não viu o filme, trata-se da história de Ventura, imigrante cabo-verdiano, que está a reviver obsessivamente e até de forma patológica um momento decisivo na sua vida que coincide com o início do processo revolucionário e do processo de descolonização português. E aquilo que é interessante é que, de facto, existe esse expressionismo cinematográfico. Há corredores infinitos neste filme, há portas que se fecham sozinhas. A escuridão tem uma positividade que não é mera ausência de luz, ou seja, a escuridão, neste filme e noutros do Pedro Costa, tem o seu valor intenso que vale tanto quanto a luz, não é a ausência de uma coisa. E isto não é tudo uma afetação estilística. De facto, estas formas estão ao serviço da tal interpenetração dos tempos de que eu falava. Mas qual é o grande perigo, por vezes, na abordagem do cinema de Pedro Costa, que se vê repetidamente na crítica, que é a de extrair deste filme, bem como de outros, de Pedro Costa, um slogan humanista da memória, uma versão humanística da memória e sloganizada, por essa expressão, em que se reduz este cinema a um cinema que procura recordar os esquecidos, dar fala aos sem fala, dar lugar aos sem lugar. Que, atenção, é uma interpretação legítima, longe de mim querer desautorizar esta ou aquela interpretação, mas, a meu ver, tem de se lhe juntar muitas outras. E uma que eu vou propor, que tem justamente que ver com o virtual da memória, é o esquecimento. O esquecimento como duplo vital da memória. E eu tenho aqui, sobretudo, em mente, quando digo isto, a segunda consideração intempestiva de Nietzsche, em que Nietzsche fala justamente no poder do não histórico como um poder vital. É um poder que regula a vida de qualquer ser que se queira conservar como vivo. Porque um ser deve digerir todas as informações, todos os factos que se lhe apresentam, toda a história que o toca, ele deve digeri-la e deve operar uma seleção vital. Portanto, deve esquecer tanto ou ainda mais do que recorda. O que é que se verifica quando um ser é incapaz de esquecer? E Nietzsche fala repetidas vezes nisto. Verifica-se um estado de insónia. É como que um animal que não dorme e é como que um historiador cujo sentido histórico está hipertrofiado. E agora perguntam, o Ventura não surge na qualidade de historiador neste filme, bem como a Vitalina Varela também não, mas são figuras que são tocadas pela história e parecem figuradas neste estado de insónia porque estão condenadas a recordar, a ser incapazes de esquecer aquilo que o país em que de momento se encontram pura e simplesmente ignora. Não se trata de Portugal ter esquecido estas histórias. Daí que até o slogan recordar os esquecidos parece infeliz, porque há um total desconhecimento da população portuguesa em geral. Enfim, poderia-se discordar disto, mas há de facto uma dinâmica que é a da ignorância. Mas corremos um perigo se nos detivermos também só nesta dinâmica do esquecimento e recordação, porque parece que a memória se trata apenas de um assunto pessoal e de um assunto subjetivado. Ora, como eu há pouco disse, o virtual envolve um fundo de relações que precede os seres individuados. E, portanto, é mesmo este fundo pré-individual que eu quero trazer ao primeiro plano. E para mim não me ocorre um filme que faça isto melhor que o do Gus Van Sant, o Elephant. O Elephant é um filme que, como vocês sabem, trata um acontecimento traumático na história americana recente, um massacre numa escola de Columbine, e o título refere-se, isto também é célebre, refere-se a uma parábola indiana de um grupo de cegos que apalpam diferentes partes de um elefante e cada um deles, há um que apalpa a tromba, outro as patas, outro a cauda, e o que sucede é que cada um deles toma essa parte pelo todo. E, portanto, nenhum deles tem uma imagem total do elefante e ficam-se, enfim, pelas suas parcialidades. Há uma leitura incorreta que se pode fazer desta parábola, incorreta ou precipitada, que é a de dizer que, pois então, basta juntar as peças do puzzle, basta ter todas as partes e temos uma verdade reconstituída. Ora, nem isto é suficiente sobre a parábola, como também não é sobre o filme. O Gus Van Sant, em várias entrevistas, aliás, afirmou que não existe uma verdade como destino neste filme. Nós não estamos perante um mal policial. Se ele reproduz isto a nível narrativo, colocando as várias perspectivas de vários intervenientes nos acontecimentos desse dia, ele não o faz para que nós, como espectadores, juntemos as várias partes para reconstituir uma unidade perdida. Não existe aqui a verdade como ponto de chegada. Pelo contrário, se se quer sublinhar a posição relativa de cada um deles, é para mostrar como, na via de acesso que cada uma destas personagens tem aos acontecimentos daquele dia, está o absoluto, está a sua singularidade, a expressão máxima da sua singularidade. Só que, mais uma vez, isto não se situa a um nível subjetivo, pessoal, da recordaçãozinha, mas situa-se num nível que o Deleuze chama várias vezes como a memória do mundo. O cinema da imagem-tempo, este cinema do pós-guerra, que ainda encontra ecos hoje em dia, é um cinema onde os sujeitos estão no tempo, em vez do tempo emanar dos sujeitos como memória. Lá está. Por isso, o recurso ao flashback era tão comum nesse cinema anterior da imagem em tempo, na imagem em movimento, e torna-se muito raro e irregular no cinema da imagem em tempo, porque precisamente os movimentos aqui implicados são os de um passado em geral, são os de um passado que não cabe na historiazinha de vida de cada pessoa. Portanto, neste filme, como é que a relacionalidade é encenada? Com este movimento que ocorre diversas vezes ao longo do filme. Em que temos uma personagem a atravessar um corredor, a caminhar pela escola. Isto é repetidas vezes encenado, não é por acaso. Não é pode-se falar numa estética do corredor ou uma estética do percurso, mas aquilo a que isto apela é um nível da memória que é um nível muscular. O Brian Massumi fala muito na memória muscular da relacionalidade, que é a propriocepção. A propriocepção é a noção de um corpo em relação ao meio que o rodeia, que se configura sempre a um nível autonómico. Nós, quando estamos a conduzir ou a sair do nosso local de trabalho, muitas das vezes não nos apercebemos de que o estamos a fazer, não estamos a pensar ativamente, eu estou a conduzir ou eu estou a sair do local de trabalho. Porque, de facto, é esta memória muscular que está em atividade. E, mais uma vez, o virtual é real sem se atualizar na consciência, num pensamento estanque. O último filme. Só recapitulando as premissas. Esquecimento, situação do corpo ou relacionalidade, mas ainda faltariam muitas mais, quer dizer, eu não tenho a pretensão de esgotar aqui o virtual da memória, mas uma outra premissa importante para pensar a memória é a da intensidade, porque de facto a memória, como eu disse há pouco, não se baseia num enunciado simbólico, numa comunicação, numa articulação linguística do passado. Isso ocorre sempre a um nível segundo. A memória em si mesma comporta afetividades e intensidades. E por isso mesmo pode-se morrer de memória, que é o que este belíssimo filme de Vincent Gallo, chama-se The Brown Bunny, eu arriscar-me a dizer que é o tema do filme, na medida em que, breve sinopse, temos um motociclista chamado Bud, que faz um percurso sem aparente rumo pelos Estados Unidos, assombrado pela memória de uma relação amorosa terminada, e aquilo que se verifica é que a doença da sua solidão é uma doença do tempo. Ele encontra-se como que num perpétuo presente. E daí ele se sentir atraído por este movimento da aceleração, que também é repetidas vezes encenado ao longo do filme, em que ele acelera cada vez mais, na moto, enfim, está num movimento perpétuo, mas é um movimento no presente. Porquê? Porque o passado está inacessível. E sem o passado, o presente não passa. E o futuro também não chega. Portanto, temos este movimento para a morte, que é um movimento num perpétuo presente, um movimento numa impossível atualidade sem virtual, e que depois passará a reproduzir um pouco aquele comportamento que se verifica em alguns animais, em que eles abandonam a comunidade, o grupo social, para procurar um lugar para morrer sozinhos. E é exatamente esse movimento que é encenado neste filme, embora tenho pena de estragar para quem ainda não tenha visto, embora de facto não se verifique essa meta, mas temos a ameaça do movimento tanatrópico. Bom, ditas as três, sei que já estou mesmo no limite do tempo, ditas as três premissas, será desejável então nós criarmos arquivos que sejam esquecidos, que tenham um corpo, ou seja, que tenham um género também, que tenham uma nacionalidade, que estejam situados, criarmos arquivos que também que sejam intensos ou capazes de intensidades e de afetividade e que por isso avariem com determinados descarregamentos de dados. Num nível puramente utilitário, não é de todo desejável, nem eu estarei aqui a fazer uma apologia da humanização da máquina. O que se trata, de facto, é que se quisermos pensar o nosso futuro conjunto, que vai ser um futuro de integração do humano com o maquínico, nós temos de pensar em máquinas capazes do virtual, em máquinas utópicas, e não nas máquinas que de momento dispomos, que são máquinas da mais baixa atualidade. Os multibancos, as redes sociais, são máquinas que de facto ainda não configuram o virtual, mas têm as suas próprias potências inorgânicas. Portanto, conservemos o nosso virtual, aproveitemos as potências inorgânicas das máquinas e o cinema, a meu ver, poderá realizar aqui a mediação, na medida em que combina o orgânico com o inorgânico e permite catalisar esta fuga para a frente, esta nova configuração da memória. Bom, obrigado, peço desculpa por me ter excedido no tempo.
Obrigado, Diogo Ferreira, pela chega de Louisiana a terminar este painel. Bom, I will now switch to English just to start the debate. Temenuga Trifonova is not online anymore. She sent us an email saying that she's trying to connect again, that her connection is not good enough, so maybe she'll pop up. We hope so. So we had several things here going on. We talked about classical fiction cinema, contemporary fiction cinema, documentary, different genres, war film, melodrama, documentary, comedy, horror film. We discussed memory, loss, forgetting, remembering, ethics and aesthetics, the ways film can represent history and the past through real, personal, and fictional narratives. You all talked about different types of cinema. We talked about cinema as an archival medium, so as a way to preserve memory in the form of an image, an audiovisual object. The problem, and of course, the problem of trauma and how can films thematize it and contribute to overcome it, or at least negotiate with it. So I would invite the audience to stop being shy and turning on their cameras and entering the debate, asking questions. We have, okay, so we have two questions on the chat. For now, I will start with them. Miguel Mida asks Eva Tain the following. I don't know, Eva, Eva Tain, if you want to see what's the question in the chat, you can. I don't know if you have access to it, but I will read it. Hi, Eva, could you elaborate on the usage of stop motion in the Missing the Picture as a means to convey memory to second-generation Cambodians and also people of other nations?
Thank you for your question. That's actually really interesting. It's actually because Ritipan said that he wanted to make a film about his own story and engage with his own memory of the Khmer Rouge. And he's been trying to do that for a while, but could not find the right cinematic form. And at the time, he didn't feel ready to ask real people to reenact his story, which is understandable. And so using clay figurines was his solution. And so he explained in an interview that he liked the idea of clay because it is essentially mud, water, sun, and all of these relate to earth and to the idea of life. And so in a way, these figurines allowed him to bring his family back to life in a symbolic way. And so that's why I think that he chose to use stop motion, because it was to engage with personal memory. I don't know if it answers your question.
It does, and I think I have a follow-up if you don't mind. How old was he during the Khmer Rouge? Because I'm thinking stop motion is usually with toys, and maybe he was a child, and that's why it made sense for him to use stop motion as a means to portray it.
Yes, I think you're right too, because he was 11 under the Khmer Rouge, and he said multiple times that the Khmer Rouge stole his childhood. And so maybe, yes, there's also like this symbolic dissonance with the idea of toys and childhood in the figurines.
Okay, we have a question for Miguel, Diogo, also by Miguel Mira. The question is in English, but you can answer in English or in Portuguese, whatever suits you. Olá, Diogo. Stanley Kubrick also used symmetric shots pointed down hallways to represent continuation. Do you think that because cinema is an art of visual continuation, hallways lend themselves to the idea of continuation and memory? Can you...
Antes de mais, obrigado pela pergunta. Plenamente de acordo, e é um exemplo bastante relevante. Eu diria mais, eu diria que o corredor, ninguém se pode enraizar num corredor, quer dizer, se aquela conversa toda sobre os não lugares tem algum sentido, é neste tipo de espaços. Ninguém pode criar raízes num corredor. Um corredor tem necessariamente pressuposto o movimento, a condução das pessoas, e depois, lá está, se o cinema está sempre neste... É um conjunto aberto e tem sempre a promessa de continuar, faz todo o sentido repetir muitas vezes esta imagem do corredor. Mas aqui o grande perigo é que o corredor se torne uma afetação ou que ele esteja simplesmente a denunciar o que o Kafka chama de mal infinito, que é a ideia de que por mais que uma coisa repita, aquilo que temos é a condução de um sujeito por essa coisa. Ele julga-se livre na medida em que está em movimento, mas ele está fechado num corredor, ele está como as autoestradas, quer dizer, por mais que aceleremos, há um pressuposto de controle, mas cada pessoa na autoestrada julga-se absolutamente livre. Portanto, há esta ideia do mal infinito que pode ser interessante até estudar com os corredores. Mas sim, completamente de acordo.
Sim, fez-me lembrar também um rato numa ratoeira, por exemplo. Ele também acha que está a mexer, mas não se está a mexer. Perfeitamente de acordo.
Does anyone have more questions for Ana Carolina Fiuza? Maybe I'll pose a question to you, Ana. Em português, sorry, Eva Tain. Muito interessante a sua, desculpa, não nos conhecemos, a sua intervenção. Uma coisa que me parece muito realmente fascinante no campo de estudos que esta intervenção abre é a ideia de que em 1942, portanto em plena guerra, existem filmes que são filmes de estúdio, são filmes de populares, não é? São filmes para as pessoas verem, não é cinema avant-garde, não é o cinema do realizador cambodiano de que falámos aqui também, não é o cinema do Pedro Costa, etc. Portanto, eram filmes para toda a gente ver, filmes que estavam a tematizar de alguma forma aquilo que se estava a passar. Depois há um aspecto também muito particular, muito interessante neste caso, que é geralmente as pessoas que faziam, os realizadores que realizavam estes filmes na América eram europeus. Por exemplo, o Curtis era checo, era ali da...
Não era, acho que é húngaro.
Húngaro. Por exemplo, Douglas Sirk, na altura realizou também Hitler's Madman. Há um filme do Borzage que era americano que se chama The Mortal Storm. E é muito interessante que, a sua apresentação centrava-se nisto justamente, que estes filmes, talvez tentando negociar a dimensão comercial com a dimensão reflexiva e política, na verdade o que eles fazem é recorrer muitas vezes ao melodrama enquanto género, porque no melodrama encontram uma forma, de uma maneira muito sintética e muito forte, pungente, criar esta figura que a Ana Fiuza identificou do homoduplex, não é? Desta tensão entre o pessoal e o... como dizer, o pessoal e o coletivo, o amoroso e o político. Isso é muito interessante e eu queria perguntar-lhe se a Ana se esta sua intervenção aqui se insere num trabalho mais amplo no campo desta problemática, porque é muito interessante, porque nós estamos aqui a falar sobre um filme que tematiza o nazismo e a guerra, no momento, muitas décadas depois, né, porque estamos a falar, é também um documento de memória sobre esse tempo, e no entanto, no momento estava a viver-se isso. Há aqui uma série de questões que eu considero muito interessantes e que se podem pensar justamente através do género do melodrama, que tem esta coisa muito interessante ou este aspecto muito interessante de se focar nessa indesvinculação, essa impossibilidade de desvincular o pessoal do político. Enfim, é só uma ideia para ver se isto...
o melodrama, né, tem essa característica de ser, né, de reunir vários clichês, né, do amor romântico, e por isso dá um enquadramento também, né, a própria memória. Ou seja, ela desperta, né, o que eu comecei falando, para além de um apelo cognitivo, ela desperta uma conexão, né, subjetiva. Então, faz com que quem não necessariamente esteja ligado ao evento, né, consiga se conectar a ele.
Exato.
Eu acho que no caso do Michael Curtiz e de outros diretores que foram para a América, né, não tem como não ser por mais que seja um filme de estúdio, um filme comercial e repleto de clichês, não tem como não ser em alguma medida também uma história pessoal, né, contada de um ponto de vista subjetivo, porque eles também fugiram, né, da Europa.
Exatamente.
Então, eu acho que é uma forma, na verdade, a figura do homo duplex também funciona nesse sentido, né? Que é uma forma que se encontra de contar alguma dimensão daquela história pessoal, que não necessariamente seja autobiográfica, né? Obviamente não. Mas, e aí isso vem também na esteira do esquecimento, né? Que eu acho que também permeou todas as apresentações, que é de tentar, de alguma forma, dar uma forma a esses esquecidos, né? Essas histórias que se perderam com a guerra. É todo o trabalho de memória, principalmente, né, ligado ao Holocausto, né? Que eu acho que também permeou, né, um pouco todas as apresentações aqui.
Sim, e que ressurge, por exemplo, hoje em dia num filme como Transit, do Petzold, sobre o qual falou Tamanuga Trifonova. Embora de uma maneira completamente diferente, claro. Muito mais do lado da virtualidade e da imagem cristal para a qual o Diogo Ferreira esteve a apontar durante toda a sua apresentação, esta impossibilidade de separar no cinema, em muito cinema contemporâneo, o atual do virtual, não é?
Sim.
Portanto, já há outro paradigma. Does anyone have a question for Ivan?
Good evening. I would like to talk with Eva Tain about her case study on Ricky Pan's documentaries, because she talked about the discussion between Claude Lanzmann and Steven Spielberg in the early 90s about the right of filmmakers to represent traumatic events. And that discussion reminded me another discussion that happens simultaneously in the documentary field, among documentary scholars like Bill Nichols, about the right of filmmakers to create documentary images that did not exist, but a documentary image that came from memory which was completely lost, disappeared, but filmmakers, documentary filmmakers, tried to reconstruct, to reenact that memory. So, all that theoretical discussion appear in the book. I'm right now using the chat on the book by Bill Nichols, Representing Reality. And I imagine that Eva Tain is already familiar with this book, published in the beginning of the 90s. And Bill Nichols talked in that book about a particular film, which is called History and Memory by Ria Tahiri. I'm gonna copy the title of this of this work. This is the title, History and Memory for Akiko and Takahashi by Ria Tajiri. This is the filmmaker. It's a medium-length film made in 1981. And that film ended with an image that came from stories of the filmmaker's grandmother about the experience of being in concentration camps for Japanese Americans in California during Second World War. I'm going to share my screen in order to show that image. Is this image, this one, the image of her grandmother filling with water these in order to, well, in the desert, in the California desert, filling with water this recipient in order to, well, get water in the desert. So this image never existed as archival image, but Ria Tajiri reconstructed, reenacted for her film, History and Memory for Akiko and Takahashi, and there was a controversy at the time about the right of filmmakers to reenact memories. So I think, and I'm not sure what's Batain's opinion about that, I think that probably Ricky Pan is aware of this controversy, of this discussion, because Ricky Pan's films engage with this kind of discussion from S21 to The Missing Picture, because all these films by Ricky Pan try to reenact all those images through different filmmaking techniques that, did not exist or have disappeared from archives from the period of the Khmer Rouge from 1975 to 1979. So probably Ricky Pan is answering or taking part in this discussion with a few decades later of the original discussion in the 90s, in order to prove, to show through his own films that at this point of documentary film history, it's possible for a filmmaker to create his own archival footage based on memory, on his own memories or the memories of his people. So I'm not sure if this kind of controversy is useful for your research. So I would like to hear what's your thoughts about that.
Yes, thank you for your comment. It was really enlightening. Yes, I actually, Pan in his, like in S21, for example, there were a lot of scholars who wrote about scenes of reenactment, because at some point the former perpetrators will go in the rooms and just kind of make the gestures they used to make back then and yell insults they used to yell at prisoners. But Ricky Pan was never comfortable with the idea of calling that a reenactment. And for him, it was more like body memory, and it was like an automatic response. And because I think he's not, he thinks that it's not really ethical maybe to reenact this kind of experience, because to him, it's almost like acting, and he wouldn't want to do that with the Cambodian genocide. And so that is why he tried to find other cinematic form to try to avoid this kind of voyeurist approach. And so we got recreating The Missing Picture through like the movie The Missing Picture, and then just trying to find a new form, a new documentary mode. And so in my dissertation, actually, I based my argument on Bill Nichols' book, like his book, Introduction of Documentary. And I try to say that Ricky Pan kind of mixes different modes, such as the poetic mode and the performative mode, to try to find the right form to address the Khmer Rouge. But it's just something that he will keep working on. And he says he will never be satisfied with the form he finds, and he will just try to keep working on it, but he will never find the right form to address a genocide.
A last question? No? Okay, we will end the panel, which means that we will end our first day of the conference. Thank you very much for the fascinating presentations. It was really interesting to hear you all. We will start tomorrow at 10 a.m. With a new panel in which I will be speaking with the title, I'm sorry, Places of Memory, Lugares de Memória. We hope to see you there. Thank you very much. And don't forget this conference and this panel specifically, because this is about memory, which is a joke. Thank you.